Mr. Lansky, why is it said that you are the head of the organized crime in the United States?
This is just a gullible lie. Say it long enough and you'll get the people to believe it.
Meyer Lansky is referred to as the financial wizard of the criminal underground and the Mafia's accountant. He was the second man in the National Crime Syndicate, which brought together all the major criminals in the nation, and his wealth was reported to be $300 million at the height of his influence. Translationally, Meyer means bringer of light. It's possible that Max and Jetta Sokolansky intended for their son's name to foretell his destiny. Unfortunately, history has proven that the ship's actual course was very different from its name. However, nothing could have predicted what the baby Meyer would grow up to become in the highly devout Jewish community of Grodno in the Russian Empire in 1902. Like the majority of the boys living in the settlement, he had a desire of becoming a rabbi and was well educated, but his hopes and desires were not meant to be fulfilled. Anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the Russian Empire since the end of the 19th century. This has resulted in ongoing conflicts between Russians and Jews, who are a distinctly minority group and have received little to no official protection. And a wave of Jewish exodus started. Their primary migration routes were to Palestine and the United States. Meyer's father set off to colonize the New World in 1909, but his grandfather and grandmother followed the original path. He was back on his feet in a little over a year, and his wife and kids joined him in the spring of 1911. The family that adopted the shorter last name Lansky and first resided in Brownsville later moved to the Lower East Side because it was more affordable there. Meyer was 10 years old when the family moved, but he had to start school in the first grade as he did not speak English. But Lansky showed himself to be a very talented student, and by 1914, he had been moved to grade 6, where he had established himself as a reliable honor student. He would later admit that he enjoyed going to school, particularly the math classes, which he was already attempting to apply at an early age, not only in the classroom, but also in situations that weren't entirely legal. Little Meyer enjoyed watching people play dice and figuring out the probabilities of the number he was betting on. Dice games were performed virtually daily in the neighborhood where his family settled. He got better at guessing the outcome every day, and eventually he felt that he had to take a gamble and quadruple the money his mother provided him so that he could purchase food for the entire family. Naturally, Lansky was defeated, which left his family in a very trying position. As a result of this conduct, the family was forced to survive off of bread and water for a full week. Meyer persisted in watching the games despite this, concentrating now on the players rather than the odds. And he picked up on one intriguing detail. Every day at the place he attended, the same guy was playing. He was usually fortunate at first, but as soon as the other players started to back him and put their money on the number he had drawn, his luck quickly turned against him. Lansky knew that this individual was a decoy and that the game was rigged, even if he could not yet pinpoint exactly how the numbers were manipulated. And since no one else believed in him, he had to venture with this man if he wanted to win. Meyer also wagered money when his parents sent him shopping once again. His observations turned out to be accurate this time. He prevailed. Lansky then started watching the games in other locations, many of which used the same con. With the solution to the mystery, money was starting to pile up on the table. Soon after the game, pickers chip away for their two-rod coins. And for Meyer, it is really a piece of cake. Now he wants to select a monetary wager for the upcoming Lansky show. Given his awareness of the potential repercussions of a life of crime, his decision was clear. After graduating with honors from the 8th grade at the age of 15, Lansky stopped going to school. He did accept his father's persuasion and land legitimate work at an auto repair shop, but he hadn't given up making money illegally. He was employed as the manager of a tiny illicit dice game at the age of 18. There he maintained order and, when needed, sent away unwelcome patrons. Meyer also made money by working for the unions, which at the time were at strife with the owners of the factories. Both paid thugs to use force to keep them safe. Exactly what Lansky was doing was that. After being told who needed to be beaten, he did just that. He carried out the instructions to instigate a riot at the factory. And who knows, maybe Meyer would have stayed at that level of local gangster for eternity, but Prohibition was instituted by the U.S. government in 1920, allowing hundreds of criminals nationwide to amass enormous wealth. Lansky was no different. Arnold Rothstein paved the way for Meyer and many other Prohibition-era gangsters to become wealthy. First access to fine imported products came through Lansky's relationship with Rothstein, and it was via mutual friends that the large bankroll itself was introduced. Nothing remarkable was going on with the firm. You make money, you sell, you purchase more, and you grow. At the same time, you establish new relationships and coalitions. Continuing along that line, we have to discuss Lansky's friendships with Frank Costello, whom he would have had tight economic ties with long after Prohibition, and Charles Luciano, with whom he had grown up. That wasn't all, though. If not, Lansky's peers would not have referred to him as the most intelligent gangster they had ever met. Meyer had two goals in life: becoming a gangster and searching for gold. In addition, he was a gangster within a mobster. Many people, though, are quite open about how much he actually believed. Regarding Lansky's interactions with his family, he knew nothing. He had no idea how to live, or at least could not have lived, in the same nation as him and her buddies. Or to set the metaphor aside, he and Ben Siegel not only sold illegal alcohol, but also owned a fleet of vehicles that they rented out to other bootleggers, along with drivers. Furthermore, because alcohol had to be carried out from outside the city most of the time, the enterprise was extremely well liked and profitable. Ultimately, there wasn't much rivalry because not many people were prepared to give up their vehicles without a second thought, especially when it came to drivers who would be willing to be struck by rivals' bullets. For Lansky, Prohibition had been largely effective. Okay, so he had been into a little bit of trouble, but nothing major. Furthermore, Costello and Luciano, two of his close pals, had risen rather high. The first had risen and emerged as the head of the Cosa Nostra, one of the most powerful families in the criminal underworld, while the second was on the verge of achieving his well-known political power. Along with the hundreds of thousands, if not millions in cash that Prohibition had brought in, add to this the new friends he has established across the nation, and you have a fantastic starting point to begin doing what will make Meyer Lansky famous: gambling. However, after Prohibition was repealed, he started his company a little differently. Sam Tucker and Mo Dalitz, two important Cleveland bootleggers, helped Lansky form Molaska Corporation, which provided the distilling industry with powdered molasses that had been dehydrated. Molaska Corporation was well positioned to lead the supply of this component nation because it employed innovative manufacturing processes to produce powdered molasses, an affordable additive to sugar in the liquor-making process. At that time, the business was founded in the middle of the 1920s and went by the name Lansky Group. After Prohibition, there were steep taxes on the manufacture of alcohol. All around the nation, illicit distilleries reopened, and rather than emerge from hiding and become law-abiding citizens, Lansky and his associates returned to criminal activity and began delivering goods to businesses that were operating outside the law, for which they were held financially responsible. After the government shut down one of those profitable organizations, they started looking into the raw material sources. As a result, Lansky and his partners were obliged to dissolve the company and, with the aid of attorneys, hide any evidence. Meyer therefore destroyed by hand his first chance to earn a life in the legal economy. With no alternative plans to earn legal profits comparable to bootlegging, Lansky's attention turned once more to gambling, which is how he first became acquainted with the seedier aspects of American culture. Meyer already had an interest in gambling during the start of Prohibition. He knew he was a highly skilled gambler. He opened a kind of affluent sanatorium in Saratoga known as the Lake Houses, opulent dining establishments paired with impeccably decorated casinos. After eating breakfast and getting massages and other wellness treatments, the majority of people would get together to watch the races. The festivities ended at 6 o'clock, and Meyer Lansky used to leave town to go to such gambling establishments in the middle of the 1930s to meet people there. He named his establishment Piping Rock, which he opened alongside Frank Costello and Joe Adonis. The restaurant was run by Costello, who sent his best Copacabana workers there each season. Lansky oversaw the casino directly, while Adonis attracted the wealthy patrons to his New Jersey businesses. Saratoga's holiday season ran from June to September, and during that time, the partners could earn several $100,000. For Lansky, it was his sole business at the time, and he needed something else that would generate income at other times of the year. For Adonis and Costello, it was just one source of income out of many, and he decided to act on it. He then moved to Florida, where the holidays arrived just after Saratoga's season ended. Here in 1936, a little investor named Julian Kaufman founded a casino in the hamlet of Hallandale, which is close to Miami. He started accepting bets on sports in a barn that had once held tomatoes. In the nights, individuals could play blackjack, roulette, and dice under the surrounding sheds. Although his company did not start out very well, he offered daily bingo games with a $3,000 grand prize that could be used to purchase a brand new Cadillac. He quickly turned his business, Plantation, into a popular destination for people looking to try their luck. But Kaufman was sued by religiously minded locals who targeted him. Since he was now prohibited from conducting business in the plantation, Kaufman might have closed, and gambling on Hallandale's land would have never been permitted again. However, at that same period, as he was being suited up by a local group of morally superior defenders, a man by the name of Vincent Allo approached him and made him an irresistible proposition. In addition to being a Genovese family member, Allo, also known as Blue, Lansky's closest mob buddy, promises to resolve the issue with the locals and provide financial support to transform the institution into a more respectable space in exchange for a new partnership. He gave Kaufman permission to admit a few more individuals inside, and these partners were Meyer Lansky and Vincent Allo, as you may already be aware. Kaufman agreed, understanding that it was best to follow their instructions rather than defy them. Following that, he received his part in the company and gave Lansky and Allo complete control. After being given the new business, Meyer dealt with the case right away. The plantation was ordered by the court to stop using the disputed area for its operations. Thus, to theoretically get around the injunction, Lansky just renamed his casino The Farm and transferred it to a nearby location. Still, there was a chance the locals may prevail in the lawsuit once more, therefore action was required. Meyer started by giving generously to all sectors of Hallandale society, including law enforcement, medical, hunting, and fishing. This helped to reduce the unrest a little, and Lansky went above and beyond by working with a local government to set up the ideal corrupt system. The farm paid the fine levied on the accused, which went into the municipality's coffers and at the weekly hooliganism trials held in the local court. Between Meyer and the authorities, the sum of the fine bribe was agreed upon and advanced. Similarly, Lansky arranged for City Hall to provide $35 weekly subsidies to every local family over the holiday season. Furthermore, he gave residents dozens of dollars and created a market for nearby farmers, exclusively purchasing food for the restaurant from them. To put it briefly, he turned Hallandale's residents, who had previously lived in abject poverty, into rich people. As a result, they began to see gambling as a good thing, and the local government never looked to build casinos within their borders. The farm became the most opulent and palatial sibling of the plantation when, naturally, the income from the former tomato barn was insufficient to satisfy everyone. Lansky started making investments in the region, founded a restaurant, and constructed game rooms. Thus, during the season that Meyer was already fully responsible for the enterprise, a hotel opened and a beach was set up, complete with all the modern conveniences of civilization like showers, changing rooms, sun loungers, and lifeguards on duty. Later, Hallandale saw the opening of a nearby racetrack. It wasn't just Lansky who attempted to set up every scenario conceivable to draw as many visitors to the farm as possible. America, which had finally emerged from the Great Depression by the late 1930s, was making every effort to improve the state of Florida's coastline. People were beginning to make excellent money again, and Miami and the surrounding areas developed into the most desirable winter holiday destination. In addition, investors were selecting Florida for new ventures at the same time that travelers were picking it for their vacations. In the late 1920s, there were between 10 and 20 hotels. By 1939, there were over 100. And following their treatments during the day, an equal number of Saratoga residents visited the lake houses. Folks from this area went to the beach homes. Here was where you could get the best cuisine and drinks and had a chance to lose $1,000 or $2,000. Tens of thousands of people traveled to Miami for entertainment, and thousands of them chose to spend their evenings gambling because they were experiencing an amazing rush of excitement. It was, for the most part, Las Vegas before Las Vegas, and Meyer Lansky made arguably the best purchase of his life when he unknowingly purchased an old tomato storage shed. However, Meyer avoided becoming fixated on a single profitable company and instead pursued every opportunity to increase his number of business endeavors and gaming revenue. Meyer found a loophole in Iowa and started business there too through the early 1940s. The torturer Lansky neglected to inform his teammates about the computational task he had discovered. Dodge Park was accessible to everyone. Lansky profited from this by accepting wagers on horse races. However, in order to evade the gambling prohibition, all the betting booths offered options rather than actual bets, and investors occupied the entire track instead of gamblers. If they prevailed, they may resell their choice for a higher price to the original retailer. A person's option became completely worthless if they lost. Around the same time that Lansky was conducting business in Florida and Iowa, he traveled to Cuba for the first time on business. Batista, who had taken control of the island in the early 1930s, was not happy with the state of gambling there. When the newly installed dictatorship took over some of the gambling companies in 1937, he was not happy with how they were run. The industry's mainstay, American gamblers, were frightened away year after year by fraud, subpar service, and inept staff, and Batista gave his employees orders to locate Americans to assist them in order to correct the problem. Lou Smith, a well-known horse racing manager at the time, was the first to take the position. However, Smith was limited to his area of expertise, so he suggested that Batista choose Meyer Lansky to deal with the casinos and Frank Erickson to handle bookies. Smith knew them well and could attest to their integrity. After accepting Batista's offer, Lansky worked for two sides during the winter of 1938. Cuba was on the other side, where everything needed to be dismantled, and Hallandale, where everything was well established. There were other governments whose management structures were dismantled and reconstructed besides the Cuban government. Meyer sacked every member of the previous staff and brought in a team from the states to accomplish this. Over the course of the season, the recently acquired Cuban employees collaborated and received training from Lansky's crew. And as a result of these extreme efforts, the Casino Nacional, which Lansky took over, was completely changed and once more became a popular destination for American travelers. After Batista expressed his satisfaction, Meyer decided to spend a considerable amount of time in Cuba, where he could follow his passions without worrying about rules and restrictions. He might be allowed there. However, the authorities were starting to crack down harder on gambling in America, where Lansky operated the majority of his gambling operations. And it would bring Meyer a mountain of issues very shortly. With the exception of World War II, Meyer Lansky's own personal golden age of gambling spanned the mid-1930s to the late 1940s. Dog racing in Iowa, a casino in Saratoga, a casino in Florida, and the beginning of employment in the gaming sector, Meyer was a brilliant gambler in addition to being a successful one. By the late 1940s, his old buddy Benjamin Siegel, often known by his moniker Bugsy, had not yet added a share in a lavish hotel and casino in Las Vegas to that list. Nevada was the only state to legalize gambling starting in 1931, and suddenly, massive hotel casino development started to pop up there in the early 1940s. When Siegel arrived in Las Vegas in 1941, a casino and resort complex known as El Rancho Vegas had already been constructed. A year later, the Last Frontier Hotel and Casino opened. These obstacles were previously constructed, and these establishments provided all the amenities one might want for leisure, including air-conditioned, cozy rooms, a pool, tennis courts, and most notably, a casino with a wide variety of games. These organizations helped Vegas start drawing more and more visitors each year, some of whom even made the city their permanent home. Additionally, Siegel, who operated a betting company in this area, started to realize the potential for hotel casinos. Additionally, the owner of El Rancho Vegas vehemently rejected his attempt to purchase it in 1943. Rather, in 1945, he was able to purchase El Cortez, a smaller business, and Lansky contributed $60,000 to the project in exchange for a 10% ownership. Siegel sold El Cortez in 1946, barely a year later. Taking advantage of the post-war surge in property values, he earned approximately $170,000 from it. And capitalizing on his success, he convinced his fellow gangsters to contribute to the construction of an opulent home, surpassing all others in Las Vegas. This hotel, known as the Flamingo, eventually led to a fight between Siegel and associates who proceeded to murder Bugsy. It's unclear if Lansky was aware of the upcoming assassination attempt, but even after his childhood friend had gone, he retained 10% of the hotel. The FBI also claimed that Lansky would eventually own stakes in 3 casinos: the Petrel, the Sands, and the Horseshoe. Meyer did not support Siegel's initial endeavor and only contributed money to Bugsy since they were old acquaintances. Lansky said Vegas's infrastructure was in terrible shape. People started to consider moral matters more and more as they were no longer fatigued by the economic challenges. And in response to these public aspirations, politicians who wished to pursue a career opposing casinos started to emerge throughout the states. The problem was prioritized even during the most well-known Senate hearings of that decade, which were chaired by Estes Kefauver. And it was all worthwhile. Lansky used to be able to buy people and operate a casino in peace. They wouldn't even converse with him now. Additionally, casinos in Saratoga, Florida, and Iowa, as well as dog racing, were all closed down in a few years. Law enforcement also became aware of Meyer as a result of the Kefauver proceedings, to which he was also called. Additionally, Meyer had assisted Joe Adonis in the Erode Inn case in 1952 when he was charged with conspiracy, gambling, and forgery. Moses Polikoff, Lansky's attorney, was sure he could get away with it. However, his client vehemently objected to a trial, stating that he would then have to testify in public, something he vehemently opposed. Given that his evidence would subtly implicate his associates, Meyer made the decision to enter a guilty plea. Ultimately, Polikoff was able to get Lansky prosecuted with only one count of forgery, that being a liquor license listing Frontman rather than Meyer, which resulted in an incredibly light sentence. Lansky spent a meager 3 months in jail and paid a $2,500 fine. After being freed, Meyer was at a loss for words. His casinos were all closed. His attempts to become legally recognized by renting TVs and jukeboxes to bars were unsuccessful. And things did not go well at all in Cuba following Batista's defeat in the 1944 elections. But when Batista came back to power in 1953, Lansky's only chance to rejoin the big-time gambling industry was in Cuba, especially because Meyer persisted in having doubts about Las Vegas. Meanwhile, a crisis in Cuba broke out when a U.S. lawyer who was close to Senator Richard Nixon fell victim to fraud at a casino regarding a native game known as Cubolo. In response, he declined to pay. This led to a public litigation, which the attorney prevailed in. Following that, a wave of grievances from other American travelers who had been duped in Cuba at Cubolo spread throughout the states. Batista assumed personal responsibility for this matter because he saw gambling as a major source of revenue for both the state and, naturally, for himself. Furthermore, it was discovered during his people's inspection, which exactly aligned with an independent investigation by American journalist Lester Valley, that the state's revenue was insufficient to support Cuba's gaming industry. Only 2 establishments in all of Havana, the court said, did not engage in cheating. The first is where the locals hang out and play amongst themselves, while the second area is called Montmartre, which Lansky lately completely took over. Upon recalling an old acquaintance who had assisted him in establishing the Nacional Casino almost 15 years prior, Batista offered Meyer a $25,000 per year role as his advisor. It was intended that Lansky would assist in gambling reform, removing Havana's reputation for being home to dishonest casinos. Naturally, Meyer concurred. Probably his life's dream to be recognized for his abilities and given permission to practice what he loved. And by the 1954-55 season, Batista had eradicated cheating in Havana's main gambling establishments entirely, thanks to guidance from Lansky. He also implemented a number of changes designed to facilitate American travelers access to Cuba. The number of Americans visiting Cuba without a visa for up to 1 month has significantly increased as a result of these efforts, and they can now travel there without worrying about being defrauded every day. Additionally, the government has implemented a number of changes to facilitate American travelers' access to Cuba. Meanwhile, Lansky was not only giving Batista advice, but also working on a small gambling club named Montmartre and formulating plans to create a casino in the Nacional, which at the time was Havana's most opulent hotel. They are 2 distinct places, not to be confused with the Casino Nacional, where Meyer had worked 15 years prior. Batista was presented with Lansky's concept and gave his approval. A wing of the opulent 10-story Nacional was turned into a casino in 1955 because the hotel was government-owned. Meyer was given charge of the new business, although it wasn't precisely what Lansky had envisioned. Above all, he intended to create his own casino in Cuba where he could operate legally, as he would never be allowed to work in the public sector again following a sentence in Las Vegas. And it was becoming a reality the same year, 1955. In that same year, the Cuban government passed a new hotel law that provided tax benefits to all newly constructed hotels, motels, and other lodging establishments. Conversely, the state and community received relatively little assistance from the Cuban government. Regarding this, the government was very stringent and other comparable businesses that offer lounging for tourists. In addition, new nightclubs and hotels costing more than $200,000 and $1 million respectively might seek for a casino license. Taking advantage of this legislation, Lansky started construction on the Riviera, his own hotel and casino, in 1956. And the 21-story structure with 440 rooms was completed by the end of 1957. For Meyer, the Riviera was the pinnacle of his career, greatest in terms of size, elegance, and comfort. All of the wisdom and expertise that Lansky had accumulated over the years was combined into the Riviera. At the time, it was the only one in Havana with a central air conditioning system that operated silently. There were concerts by America's top performers, and many said that the food wasn't the greatest in Cuba. Of course, you could play any sort of gambling that was popular at the time in the Riviera and be sure that the odds weren't stacked against you. Recollections from guests at the hotel indicate that Lansky succeeded in establishing an exclusive establishment devoid of any trace of gangster activities. In the midst of a street festival for commoners, it was a type of aristocratic area. Since the Riviera's official opening in December 1957, all 440 of its rooms have been occupied during the winter, and a very affluent public occupied these rooms. We might estimate amounts of hundreds of thousands of dollars per week if we rely on the memories of Cuban Norberto Peña, who collected debts from lost travelers. Peña claimed that he took on debts ranging from $10,000 to $15,000. The type of audience that was present at Meyer's casino is indicated by the fact that he simultaneously underlined that he never needed to use force and that the money was paid in cash right away upon the request to return. But in Lansky's little sanctuary, it was short-lived. After Batista left Cuba at the end of 1958, Fidel Castro took over, shifting the country's course towards socialism and expelling all the island's casino owners. After spending between $14 and $18 million building the Riviera, Meyer and his partner sold the casino. The Riviera and the casino were sold, but they only brought about $3 million. In Cuba, Lansky lost everything, his health, as well as his money and goals. Following all of this, additional cardiac issues were discovered and his pre-existing ulcer became worse. He had been admitted to the hospital twice and nothing would allow him to live. However, Meyer Lansky was able to overcome this setback to the best of his ability. Now that he had reached the 60-year mark, he needed to rediscover his strength and set new objectives in order to live. Meyer suffered a heart attack at the start of 1962, but was recovering. And in August of that same year, he made the decision to go to Europe, stopping along the way to see his people's homeland. Israel instantly captured Lansky's heart. This vacation gave him the opportunity to seriously consider leaving America, which had disappointed him so badly, and moving to the nation of his grandfather's dreams. The only issue was that he didn't have enough money to go back to his own country following the debacle in Cuba. He was compelled to retire safely in a different nation after being forced to flee his own. With a 5 to 10% stake in multiple casinos, skimming in Las Vegas was his only remaining source of revenue that was worth mentioning. It took him more than a year to accumulate the required amount at that level of profits. Furthermore, he needed to ensure that the authorities would not seize his remaining earnings. To do this, he would need to carry out a few more profitable ventures overseas, where he would typically not have to take the lead, and his involvement would be very hard to document. In case anyone was unaware, casino skimming is a highly widespread activity in the U.S., and in case you were unaware, it's also a kind of tax avoidance. And when he lost the Riviera, Lansky was profiting from that, but formally he was receiving money from his prior legitimate investments for the IRS. Thus, he owned a 20% stake in State Summerfield, a tiny oil company, and other small hotels in Florida. He had no legal issues, and this was sufficient money to cover his debit and credit match for the IRS. Lansky left the United States with his actual earnings in the manner described below. The Bank of Paris, a bank located in Miami, had a unique agreement with the Castle Bank of Nassau, a bank located in the Bahamas where it functioned as a branch of the latter. Stated differently, you may visit Miami Bank, open an account with any amount, and request that the funds be credited to the Bahamian Bank. The American bank has no paper trail. The Bahamas received all the data directly. Meyer then removed the funds from the U.S. bank authorities by traveling to Switzerland. He was therefore free to make more forward investments, the proceeds of which also ended up in Switzerland. Thus, he was able to acquire modest interests in both the Colony Casino in London and the Lucane Casino in the Bahamas, thanks to previous contacts. Lansky would live until the end of the 1960s in this pattern of securing his pension, and he would also avoid punishment for skimming through this period. The evidence would eventually find its way into the hands of the FBI, but by the end of the decade, the defense would be able to show in court that it was obtained legally, leading to a case being dropped. Meyer sold all of his Las Vegas holdings and took on the allocated cases, earning a grand total of $1 million. Now that a second tax evasion case was being compiled against him in the United States, again including Las Vegas, he was prepared to retire and move to Israel. He got away with it the last time around at the Sands Casino. The Flamingo was the target of the authorities at this point. But since the early 1950s, why had the government been so keen to bring Lansky to justice? Meyer's 3-month prison sentence was followed by a series of tax evasion proceedings, which he eventually won in the case of citizenship revocation. What makes them choose to accept Lansky? Why did they feel the need to secure a basic gambling organizer? Could the FBI's resources not be directed toward more serious offenders? Of course they were, but in the eyes of the government and the general public, Lansky was far more than just a typical casino owner, and it all started when Meyer was named by the Kefauver Senate Committee in the early 1950s as a member of the so-called New York Crime Syndicate, which controlled all the organized crime in the nation on par with the Chicago Syndicate. Actually, there were no syndicates under central authority. However, the idea of the Mafia was still relatively new to American society, and the public's perception of it was one of organized crime creating a new government and preparing to seize power. Furthermore, Meyer joined Costello and Adonis in the leadership of New York's crime syndicate after the two had worked together on several gambling endeavors. Like a snowball, it was. Initially, rumors circulated that Lansky owned nearly all the casinos in Las Vegas. Then Lansky gets rid of Mafia bosses he doesn't agree with and that he has overseas accounts worth $300 million. And through it all, he continued to lead the Eastern Crime Syndicate. FBI investigators heard bits and pieces that gave rise to all these rumors and conjectures. Later, writers and journalists made a huge deal out of a small issue. Thus, for instance, journalist Hank Messick, who wrote about Lansky in the mid-1960s, completely made up the idea of Lansky's $300 million fortune. Messick made reference to U.S. data. Internal Revenue Service providing the source of the data, and in response, the IRS categorically refuted it, claiming that they had never encountered such numbers throughout their examination of Lansky's earnings. That being said, Meyer's 1970 trip to Israel was not the departure of an exhausted elderly man hoping to retire in his native land, but rather the escape of the leader of one of the most potent criminal organizations in the United States. And he will be unable to remain in Israel due to this unwelcome notoriety. Lansky believed he would be greeted with open arms upon his arrival. He did everything in his power to support the Jewish people and the establishment of the Jewish state starting in the late 1930s. He orchestrated the disbandment of the fascist party's protests in New York. Due to his Mafia connection, he was able to assist with the transfer of weaponry to Israel during port disruptions and regularly made donations to a number of Israeli institutions and organizations. And the Israeli government refused to grant him citizenship. He filed a lawsuit against the Israeli government for his own transgression, but Lansky wasn't the only one, claiming that he should be granted citizenship since he is a Jew, but his lawsuits were unsuccessful. Furthermore, Lansky received an order to leave Israel in September 1972. He was facing tax evasion charges in the States at the same time. Meyer was even charged with contempt of court since he naturally skipped the hearing when it was brought to court. His passport was also revoked by U.S. authorities. Lansky could only now lawfully leave Israel and return to the United States, where he would almost certainly end up in prison. Meyer, however, was not going to give up easy because this was not the pension he desired. He got a visa to Paraguay, where there was no extradition to the United States at the time. With the assistance of friends he established in Israel, especially Yossi Sheiner, who had served as the Prime Minister of Israel's security chief under David Ben-Gurion. And Lansky departed Israel in November 1972. He took a plane to Zurich first and then to Rio de Janeiro, where he transferred to a flight to Buenos Aires and lastly to Paraguay. The fact that the jet from Argentina was only scheduled to make one stopover in Paraguay before arriving in the United States was the only factor that Lansky and Sheiner, who helped him, failed to consider. Thus, Lansky was not released by the two FBI agents who boarded the plane in Paraguay. They were alluding to the fact that due to Lansky's legal issues, Paraguayan officials had just decided moments before to deny him entry into the nation. All Meyer had to do was sit in his seat and watch the plane take off from Paraguay and land at Mariana because he was unable to confirm this information or force his way out of the aircraft. Lansky was not physically in time to fly in from Israel, therefore his first court hearing following his return was a contempt of court trial, which he ultimately won since there was not enough time between the subpoena's issuance and the court date. After that, his health began to decline, necessitating a heart operation in March 1973, following which he should have recovered for at least a year. However, the authorities were keen to lock him up, so in July of that year, a tax evasion trial got underway. Lansky also prevailed in this case because Meyer's attorney exposed the prosecution's highly dubious witness. If allowed to remain free, Lansky would attempt for a number of more years to apply for Israeli citizenship directly from the United States, but his attempts would ultimately be unsuccessful, and Meyer would accept it. Particularly considering that he has been fighting these litigations for nearly 4 years, starting in Israel, and that he was saving money to live in the country of his choice and ancestors, his savings have been nearly completely exhausted. He was actually even your average retiree now. He would get together for breakfast with pals like Vincent Donlow and Harry Rosen, and they would engage in lengthy animated discussions about the past or present without mentioning the future. Every now and then, the younger Florida mobster generation would join them, fascinated by tales of Prohibition, Cuba, and Las Vegas. The buddies would typically split up in the afternoon, with Meyer returning home to recuperate and regain energy for his evening walk with his cherished dog. He met his buddies for breakfast the following day, took an afternoon nap, went for a stroll, had supper, and napped again. But Meyer started to lose these pleasures bit by bit. His health started to worsen once his pals started passing away. Lansky was given a cancer diagnosis in 1980. He underwent surgery to remove the tumor in the same year, but it returned in 1982. Meyer Lansky ultimately lost his fight with death on January 15, 1983, when he passed away in a hospital room. This was the life narrative of Meyer Lansky, a fighter, a gangster, a lucky man.